Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of Puerta de Ideas for inviting me to share my work with you today. My name is Denise Ho. I'm historian of modern China. I teach at Georgetown University in the Asian Studies program. My talk today is entitled Antiquity in Revolution, the Shanghai Museum and the Legacies of China's Mao period. So this talk comes from some of the research that I conducted for my first book, Curating Revolution. This book is a study of museums and exhibitions in China during the Mao years after 1949, and particularly about the relationship between politics and material things, including art. My research for this book included a year that I spent in the Shanghai archives, as well as interviews with people who were curators, staff, and visitors. And I'll be talking about some of those interviews and sharing the content of what I learned with you today. Central questions of my book include things like how national patrimony is created and who art belongs to. So I'm particularly excited to be able to have the chance to share my research with an audience who has such a deep interest in art and culture. I'm also inspired by the theme of this year's festival, the power of words, because the story that you will hear today is also a story about words and actions, and words as actions. So let me start first by situating us in place and in time. First, let's start with place. Today, I'll be talking about the Shanghai Museum. So Shanghai is a city on China's central coast. Sometimes it's referred to as the Pearl of the Orient. So it's a big city, it's a cosmopolitan city, and this can be represented by both sides of the Shanghai skyline. So on one side, you see examples of, this is the Shanghai Bund, so the colonial, the Western architecture on one side of the Pudong River. On the other side of the Pudong River, you see a futuristic skyline, so a juxtaposition between the colonial past and the future. Sometimes Shanghai is compared to global cities like Paris and New York. Incidentally, it's also the place where the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. I want to start with a question. How many of you have been to China? Wow, quite a lot. How many of you have been to Shanghai? Wow, also quite a lot. Wonderful. So if you've been to Shanghai, chances are you've been to some of its museums. And so, like Chile, Shanghai also has a variety of museums. So Shanghai has house museums. So for example, like the Museo La Chascona, which I had the good fortune of visiting with my family just a few days ago, Shanghai has the Lushun Museum on the bottom right there. This is a museum, this is the former home of the person who is considered the father of modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun. Shanghai also has museums of art and art history. So similar to the Museum of Pre-Columbian Art, we have the Shanghai Museum on the bottom right in this picture, and this is the museum that we'll be talking about today. I'll be telling you the story of the Shanghai Museum. But interestingly, Shanghai does not have a museum of memory. So I had the very great honor of visiting the Museo de la Memoria, which is a site that does important work reckoning with the traumatic past. But China has no analog to this kind of museum. And in my talk today, at the very end, I'd like to reflect a little bit about why that is, and why such ordinary voices like the ones you'll be hearing today are so important if we were to have such a museum of memories in China. So now we're familiar with place. I want to situate ourselves in time. Today I'll be talking about China's Mao era. And this is a time historians sometimes refer to this as China's era of high socialism. So the period between when the People's Republic of China was established in 1949 to Mao's death, which was in 1976. This era is marked by political campaigns, traumatic events that were based on class struggle. This era included a great famine that took the lives of some 30 million people. This is a period of collective and state violence. Perhaps one of the most important campaigns from this period is the Cultural Revolution, which begins in 1966 and ends in 1976. During the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao Zedong, led an attack on his own party and his own leaders. There was a cult of Mao that served to mobilize and also to control. And young people were sent to make, first they made rebellion as Red Guards, which I'll be telling you about in a minute. And then they were later sent down to the countryside, a mass migration of some 17 million young people to the countryside. And so in popular understanding, the Cultural Revolution is sometimes referred to as the 10 years of turmoil. And those young people who are sent to the countryside, sometimes they're referred to as China's lost generation. Here I want to pause for a moment and think about the relationship between revolution and history, revolution and tradition, and revolution and antiquity. So when we imagine a revolution, we often think about a rejection and sometimes a destruction of the past, right? A revolution is a repudiation of the past. But museums, the subject of our talk today, are institutions that preserve the past. So what happens when you have a revolution? What happens to this tradition? What happens to antiquity? So the questions for us today include, during the Cultural Revolution, what happened to China's art and artifacts? What was the role of institutions like the Shanghai Museum? And then, having learned this story, how do we think more broadly about the relationship between antiquity and revolution? So what you see depicted on this poster is a campaign from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. It's referred to as the attack on the four olds. So the four olds are old thinking, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And the people you see here in the poster, this is a woodcut, a traditional form of art, repurposed for modern propaganda. The young people you see in the poster are Red Guards. They're dressed in military uniform. This is how you can tell. They're also wearing a red armband that says Red Guard. Their leader waves a flag. You see at the very front that has an image of Chairman Mao in profile, and in Chinese it says 造反有理, to rebel is justified. And under their feet, so this is how you know this is about the destruction of the four olds, under their feet here, you see all of the things that they are called upon to destroy. So for example, you have a Buddha, you have a crucifix, you have dice, you have film, a roll of film, for example. All of these things are seen as objects that represent the so-called four olds. The call to attack the four olds resulted in the ransacking of private homes, the burning of books, the destruction of temples, and the destruction of churches. So now we have ourselves in time, in place. Let us travel together to Shanghai and see how the attack on the four olds began in that city. So here you have, in the southwestern corner of Shanghai, the Longhua Pagoda. This structure dates from the Song Dynasty, and it was celebrated as one of Shanghai's 8 famous vistas. So if you were a tourist in early 20th century Shanghai, this is one of the places that you would have to visit. On August 23rd, 1966, as the Cultural Revolution began in Shanghai, a group of Red Guards, who called themselves the Burn the Pagoda headquarters, went to this pagoda. They looped ropes around the base of the pagoda, preparing to tear the pagoda down. But as they prepared to pull it down, as they prepared to destroy it, a second circle, this time of people holding hands, formed around the pagoda as well. One person who was there that day, a young worker from the Shanghai Museum, her name is Zhong Yinlan, she told me in an interview, we explained to the Red Guards that the pagoda was Wanwu. It was a cultural relic, not one of the four olds. So then other museum workers, college students, and ordinary people joined hands together around the pagoda, shouting, "Do not burn, do not burn." And at the end of the day, the Longhua Pagoda stood. So despite the attack on the Four Olds, there are historic sites around China that were spared destruction. Oftentimes there is a local legend about the site. A tour guide might tell you, for example, or in the old days when we had guidebooks, the guidebooks might say, the reason we still have this temple is because there was a central order from the Chinese premier, from Zhou Enlai, saying you must protect this historic site. But what I want to suggest to you today is that there has to be something else. It's not just about the central leader. It's not just about those courageous and brave people who were holding hands around the pagoda. That in fact, there is an institutional response and a centralized response that work together to preserve these objects of antiquity. So let's then go to the Shanghai Museum and figure out how this worked. Let's go behind the scenes together at the museum. Okay, so first, before we start, we need to understand that there are a few different institutions that work together as the cultural bureaucracy. They include the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission and the Shanghai Museum. So two institutions working together as the cultural bureaucracy in Shanghai. And together, they are in charge of Shanghai's Wanwu, or cultural relics. Oops. Okay. So we're going to learn one Chinese word together today. And we're going to learn the word Wanwu. It's composed of two characters. So the first character, wen, is for culture. It's often used in the words for language, for example, one. And then wu is a general word that means a thing, an object, or material. So one plus wu together, Wanwu, is cultural object or cultural relic. Can we try that together? Wanwu. One more time, Wanwu. Eso, all right, good job. So now you all know one Chinese word, but it's probably not the most useful word if you're a tourist. All right, so we know Wanwu, and that's a word I will use today. Let's go to the Shanghai Museum. So the Shanghai Museum is established in 1952. This is just 3 years after the People's Republic of China was itself founded. First, it's housed in a former racecourse building in the center of Shanghai. And then it moves to a bank, an Art Deco style bank. And the Shanghai Museum I'll describe to you today is the Shanghai Museum in that bank. And in the 1990s, there's a modern new Shanghai Museum built. And those of you who've been to China or been to Shanghai, you probably visited the Shanghai Museum there in the center of the city in what was used to be People's Square, and now it's called People's Park. Okay, all right, so we have the Shanghai Museum as an institution. We also should learn a little bit about how a museum functions. Usually, we're members of the public, right? When we go to a museum, we see the exhibition, we see the curatorial part. But behind the scenes, as a museum, you need to collect, right? And you need to train your staff. So how does this work? I want to start with collection, which we can think about collection as the first step in curation. Without Wanwu, without objects, you don't have anything to curate. So in 1972, when the Shanghai Museum was established, it had about 7,000 objects. And there are two main ways that the museum acquired new pieces: purchase and donation. And in the case of purchase, in the early 1950s, the Shanghai Museum received fully 1/3 of its municipal budget allocated for culture and education. With the mayor of Shanghai at that time, his name was Chen Yi, he intervened to approve purchases of art. So Li Zunjie, a member of the museum who joined in 1952, he told me in an interview, we would bring out the good stuff and invite Leader Chen to take a look. And we would ask, should we buy it? And he would say, yes, let's buy it. And then we would say, well, what if we don't have enough money? And he would say, go ahead, write a report, and I'll approve it. So one of the things you have to remember about the 1950s is that you actually can still buy and sell on the open market until 1956, until socialist transformation, when the state nationalizes the art market. So you have this period where you can buy and sell antiquities. The second way you can acquire new artwork as a museum is through donation. By 1959, over 1,000 people in almost 200 units had donated a total of 70,000 Wanwu to the museum. Another thing to remember about Shanghai is that this is a wealthy city. It's a center of art, a center of connoisseurship. And especially during the Second World War, when wealthy people around Shanghai came to seek refuge in the city, what did they bring with them? They brought their art and antiquities. So these collections could be sold to the museum. They could also be donated to the museum. And people would receive in exchange, oftentimes not very much money at all, but they could have things like political recognition, benefits like housing, jobs, or university places for their children. And in turn, museum officials, they were very familiar with the collectors. They knew who had what kind of collections. And this will become very important to our story. The second aspect of the Shanghai Museum's work that I think we should understand is the training of its staff. So how do you train a new generation of art collectors or art connoisseurs in socialist China? So the young woman I quoted, the woman who went to the Longhua Pagoda and held hands with all of the other people, she joined the museum in 1952. She hadn't even finished middle school or junior high school in the Chinese context. We can think of the Shanghai Museum as having three generations. So this first generation, which you see represented on the upper right, these are the collectors, the artists, and the museum staff who were active before 1949. They're the ones who create the exhibits at the very beginning in 1952. They create the catalog, and they're the ones who train the youngest generation. So that's Zhong Yinlan there on the very far right. They give her lessons in art history, and art appraisal. The second generation, in the middle, is a younger cohort of junior leaders who had joined the Communist Party underground as art workers. So we have this eldest generation, the elder group of artists, and you have this younger group, the Communist Party underground art workers. They take up in the leadership, and then this very young generation who joined the museum in the 1950s. For her part, Zhong Yinlan started her training as a docent, but because she had such beautiful handwriting, they chose her to work on the catalog. In 1959, she was selected to study painting for appraisal. And to do this, she actually had to do this in a very old-fashioned way. Every Monday morning, she would go to the home of an elderly artist who was also a collector, and even before he woke up, she was like a student in imperial times, cleaning the desk, grinding the ink, preparing the paper to have her art lesson. And for the following 7 years, she painted every night, or she practiced her calligraphy on the one table that her family owned. She had to wait until her brothers were finished doing their homework, and then she would paint and do calligraphy. She was made a full-fledged appraiser in 1966, the year the Cultural Revolution began. So when the attack on the Four Olds began, what was happening in Shanghai? What was happening in the Shanghai Museum? The Shanghai Museum, which you see depicted here, it shut its doors, it packed up all of its objects. As we've already seen, museum workers went to places like the Longhua Pagoda to try to protect those historic sites. But what happened to objects in private collections? The Shanghai Museum installed a 24-hour hotline, so a telephone hotline, and the young workers of Zhong Yinlan's generation joined a rotation where they slept next to the telephone. She described what it was like to me, what it was like to be on call. She said, if we heard that a certain household was going to be searched, if Red Guards were coming to attack the Four Olds, we would go at once. The Shanghai Museum would send people at once. It didn't matter what time it was, if it was midnight, if it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, if there was a collection with paintings and calligraphy, I would go immediately. I never got to return home. Her account of the story of Liu Jingji, a former textile manufacturer and collector of paintings, is worth recounting at length. So again, this is something she told me in an interview. She says, I arrived at Liu Jingji's house and spent the entire night there, from 6 p.m. to 11 o'clock in the next morning. He had many paintings, almost 2,000 or more. And here you see some examples from his collection. He stood there. So he's being attacked. He's being criticized by the Red Guards. He stood there until the rebels left, and then he snuck back inside. And then he saw me. He saw me writing the inventory, and he came to stand next to me while I stood there, writing out the names of the paintings one by one. This is such and such painting. This is by so-and-so artist. He stood there for a long time, and then he said to me, "Miss, you seem to be a Wanwu expert. What work unit are you from?" And I said, "The Shanghai Museum. Our museum will protect them." And then he began to show me other things. He showed me this painting and that painting, and he said, "Take them away. Take them all away. Don't leave a single one behind." In the post-Mao years, this story has been told and retold, becoming part of Shanghai Museum lore. Yet we may think of this as an exceptional story. Liu Jingji was a famous person. His collection was known. Many people, or in fact most other people, did not fare so well. The fate of Wanwu in Shanghai may be better represented by a report by the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission in October of 1966. And this report told a tale of destruction. Most were not as fortunate as the Longhua Pagoda. All the images of the gods in the city god temple were smashed. All the Buddhas in the Chengshang Pavilion were destroyed. All of the Wanwu and Jing'an temple were lost. And the cross on Xujiahui Cathedral was torn down, its interior torched. But between the lines, this report shows that the Shanghai Cultural Relics Campaign, or Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission, was engaged in a quiet campaign of salvage. Some sites were determined to have historical value, and the commission requested that photos were taken and surveys were made. Surviving artifacts had to be sent to local museums. Finally, the commission stressed that if there was going to be any kind of construction, any kind of agricultural development, it should first retain the right to coordinate excavation. So these documents and oral histories suggest that there was a larger and systematic mechanism to protect antiquity at the height of revolution. And in addition to this mechanism, this defense would also need revolutionary words. And cultural workers, like the ones you see here, are going to help figure out how to say these words. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, okay, is this just a story of Shanghai? Did this happen elsewhere in China? Those of you who've traveled to China, you've probably also visited Beijing and been to the Palace Museum, so another very important historic site. And so here the answer is complicated. It's not just about a story of a single order from the Chinese premier. So this is Qi Benyu. He is one of the members of the Central Cultural Revolution group. He's actually himself a historian. On the left-hand side, you see the Palace Museum in winter. So the Palace Museum under the snow. So in December of 1966, Qi Benyu goes to the Palace Museum to give a speech. And in the speech, he makes an argument for a revolutionary palace museum in which Wanwu should be protected as the people's property and used to raise their class consciousness. 2 months later, February of 1967, Qi convened a second meeting with members of Beijing's cultural bureaucracy. So people who work in bookstores, in museums, in libraries, also people who work in paper mills that recycle paper. He's alarmed to hear that Beijing residents are destroying their own collections. They're burning their own books. They're burning their own calligraphy and paintings. And that the institutions that previously would have protected those things were afraid to intervene. So at this meeting with the cultural bureaucracy, Qi declared, "You should write a petition. The proletariat needs these kinds of things. And you also need these things as subjects of criticism." And in fact, we have an example of such a petition, where we can find it. So Beijing cultural workers circulated such a petition, and here you can see that in the document, they argue that despite the four olds, it's important to remember Chairman Mao's words, that Chairman Mao himself said that China had a magnificent ancient culture. A few days later, all of the central parts of the bureaucracy, the Minister of Culture, the State Bureau of Cultural Relics, they all issue orders to protect objects from being melted down for scrap metal. You think about metal Buddhas, for example, being turned into metal objects instead. And in the following months, the Central Committee, the State Council, and the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee, they all issued orders to protect objects, to preserve the old in order to build the new. And in February, Zhong Yinlan, our young woman, went to work in the shell of Shanghai's Xujiahui Cathedral. She was working for a new team, a new institution. We'll call them the Wanwu Small Group. It eventually had over 100 workers. 100 other people were working with her. By September, the Wanwu Small Group had received almost 300,000 Wanwu and over 350,000 volumes of books, not including the items that were salvaged from the scrap metal plants and the paper pulping mills. It compiled an index, including photographs of the most valuable treasures, Shang and Zhou bronzes, ceramics from Song to Qing, books, seals, currency, and handicrafts. And the Wanwu Small Group justified its work in two ways. It used Mao's writings, for example. It went back to Mao's earliest writings in the 1930s, saying, "Today's China is an outgrowth of historic China. We are Marxist historicists. We must not mutilate history. From Confucius to Sun Yat-sen, we must sum it up critically, and we must constitute ourselves the heirs to this precious legacy." It also glorified the Red Guard house searches as cultural preservation for the masses, saying this was a great victory for Mao Zedong thought. The Wanwu Small Group continued to work throughout the Cultural Revolution. Between June of 1967 and December of 1968, it received over 3 million Wanwu and handicrafts and almost 6 million volumes of books. So when we think about some of the libraries in China today, the reason they have their special sections of ancient books is because of this group. Here's a photo of the staff of the Shanghai Museum in the fall of 1967. And Zhong Yinlan, we see her, she's right here, right underneath the placard and underneath the characters for revolution. The story of interaction, I think, the story of the connection between Beijing and Shanghai shows us that there's central orders that are carried out by the locality, that there's an institutional response, and that it was also important to have an ideological justification. We think about, so the theme of this year's festival is the power of words, right? So here we have powerful words. Preserving antiquity was a necessary part of revolution. So what about the Cultural Revolution in terms of collection? The Wanwu Small Group's reports make it sound like everything they did was all part of the same plan, right? It was all part of the plan. It all worked together. This was our idea from the beginning. But I think that if you look at the archival documents, as I have, you can see that there are actually two different movements. The very beginning of the Cultural Revolution, in the fall of 1966, Zhong Yinlan and her colleagues were intercepting the Red Guards in order to protect historic sites, in order to save private collections from being destroyed. And in the case of the latter, you had records, right? You have evidence. Zhong Yinlan would be part of a team of 3 people. She was the one to appraise it because she had the knowledge of the painting. And then there was somebody to put things into boxes. And there was also a scribe to keep the records. And in fact, we also have examples of the receipts that she issued. And here, Zhong Yinlan, her signature is at the very bottom of this receipt, and some of the items here are calligraphies and landscape paintings. So fall of 1966, you have this rescue operation. And then in 67, the work of the Wanwu Small Group was to collect and sort through thousands of objects, many of which had no known provenance. So what was the staff of the Wanwu Small Group sorting for? Part of their job was to determine what was art and what was a handicraft. What was art and what was a handicraft? And so according to the official definition, Wanwu, an antiquity, was an art object dating from the period of the Qianlong Emperor or before, so from the 17th century or earlier. And what was a handicraft? What was Gongyipin? The thing about a handicraft is that handicrafts were allowed to be sold. So they could be sold through the state export company and sent overseas. So part of the rescue in this second part of the story was to stop some of those objects from being sent overseas. Zhong Yinlan and her colleagues petitioned the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee. They said, it's not scientific. How can you cut art history in half like that and say part is art and the other is handicraft? And so in this way, her petition was approved. Zhong Yinlan combed through the warehouses of export companies, and brought back with her some 60,000 objects. So how do we interpret this? How should we interpret the actions of the Shanghai Museum and the Wenwu Small Group? I think there are two arguments to be made. The first argument is that it's as the Red Guards described. It's a confiscation of Wenwu and books to be returned to the working masses. Dean Liu has made a study of the Shanghai Museum that demonstrates that within the first 15 days, the first 2 weeks of the attack on the Four Olds, the Shanghai Museum inventoried over 6,000 objects, of which 38 were top tier, the most precious treasures, more than the average in any other previous year. She also shows that between 1966 and 1969, the Shanghai Museum increased its collection by 71%. In this interpretation, the Shanghai Museum is a little bit like the Revolutionary Louvre Museum in Paris, right? We don't realize that the Louvre was a product of the French Revolution, in which the works of art were returned to their rightful owners, the people. The sale of handicrafts overseas is not unlike the sale of artwork by the Soviet Union, where the Museum Department of the People's Commissariat of the Enlightenment sold objects in exchange for gold to fund the Soviet Union's industrialization. And preservationist appeals to heritage or historical tradition are not limited to a revolutionary context. In Vichy France, for example, collaborators argued for French patrimony in order to retain artwork that was confiscated by Jewish collectors. And yet I think there is a second, more nuanced argument to be made. The Shanghai Museum and the Wenwu Small Group did issue receipts when artwork was known. In 1984, Shanghai local officials were charged with returning Wenwu to their original owners, and the Wenwu Small Group estimated that among those items accounted for in 1986, 76% of Wenwu found their way back to their former owners. This was the case for Liu Jingji, this man whose story I told earlier. He was so overjoyed to see his collection that he told Zhong Yinlan, you can pick 40, take whatever you want, and we'll donate them to the museum. And of course, because she was an expert, she chose the 40 best ones, and that's why we have them in the Shanghai Museum today. But of course, there's so many objects that were never accounted for. Some were destroyed outright during the attack on the Four Olds. Some made their way to the Wenwu Small Group stations without any knowledge of their provenance. And that some that were inventoried in 1967-68 had disappeared by 1986. The state made monetary restitution for almost 2 million items in this final category. We might ask ourselves also, what did the historical actors think of what they were doing? And this is one of the benefits of doing the history of the recent past. Sometimes you're lucky enough to interview those historical actors. In oral histories, Zhong Yinlan is adamant that objects that she rescued were being taken care of on behalf of the collectors. She described to me the years that she spent in the countryside sorting out Wenwu. She says, we had a very high consciousness. We didn't pay any mind to our living conditions. If one day a painting from the Qianlong period would jump out at us, or a painting from the Ming Dynasty, a Dongqichang painting, we were overjoyed. What a wonderful thing, a Dongqichang painting. For Wenwu to be preserved with our own hands, this is a thing with great meaning. This is something that made us very happy. Another one of Zhong Yinlan's contemporaries, Zhu Li, who was dispatched from the state-run antiquities market to work for the Wenwu Small Group, he told me in an interview, other people could go out and make revolution. Other people could rebel. I would go and study art. And there were all of these things that I had never been able to see before, and suddenly I could see them, and they made my heart rejoice. Perhaps the irony is that though the Cultural Revolution rhetoric was eventually repudiated, collecting antiquity was for the masses after all. First, to cultivate the generation that came of age in New China, and then to be curated for the public in the post-Mao era of reform. I'd like to conclude with 3 reflections on museum culture in today's China. how cultural patrimony is celebrated, how socialist achievements are curated, and how unofficial history persists. So on the first topic, this is the National Museum of China. It's formerly referred to as formerly called the Museum of the Revolution. It's built in 1959. It's on Beijing's Tiananmen Square. So this is the National Museum of China. On this first topic of how cultural patrimony is celebrated, I hope today's lecture has shown you that China's antiquity has always been part of the revolutionary narrative. Cultural nationalism is central to political legitimacy, from the Mao years to the present. The celebration of history and culture in Xi Jinping's China is not new. It's one of the cornerstones of Chinese communism. It's part of revolutionary praxis. Another continuity between the Mao era and the present is, as I write about this elsewhere in my work, it's about the curation and celebration of China's socialist achievements. So here you see, for example, photographs celebrating big infrastructural projects, for example. During the Mao years, these kinds of projects were displayed at revolutionary history museums. And today, if you go to the National Museum of China, you'll see the permanent exhibition is entitled The Road to Rejuvenation, and the story of the socialist era is a story of socialist construction, as well as, for example, China's diplomatic relations around the world. But what about the history of the Cultural Revolution itself? Today's lecture has told a story of cultural preservation and not cultural destruction. But it's important not to forget that the Cultural Revolution was a period of violent class struggle, of factional fighting, and of radical politics. There's no official death toll, but the Stanford sociologist Andrew Walder has estimated that it took the lives of some 1.6 million people. Next year, 2026, is the 60th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, and yet the topic remains taboo in China today. There's no coverage of the Cultural Revolution in the National Museum of China. There are a few private museums. There are a few private museums that have objects from the Cultural Revolution. So for example, on the upper left, this is a museum of a private collector who collects propaganda art, propaganda posters. And that's the owner of the museum talking to some of my former students. On the bottom right, it's called the Jianchuan Museum Cluster. This is also a private museum in Western China in Sichuan province. And this is also a private collection that has objects from the Mao era. But they're all kind of ordinary objects of everyday life. So the items you see there on the right are everyday, they're mugs, they're metal cups that have inscriptions, revolutionary quotes, and iconography on them. But we have no Museo de la Memoria for the traumatic events of the Mao years. Even though as early as 1986, the Chinese writer Ba Jin called for a museum of the Cultural Revolution, where, as he wrote in this essay, a place where masks will fall, where each person will search his or her own conscience, where the true face of each one will be revealed, and large and small debts from the past will be repaid. Ba Jin also warned in his essay that only those who do not forget the past will be masters of the future. But China still has not had the chance to imagine what such a museum would look like. So for now, such unofficial memories remain. Where can we find them? Where do they live? They live in the realm of memory, in the domain of the private. They live in the shadows of the internet, in the sojourns of the diaspora, and in oral histories like the ones that I've shared with you today. These words, I suggest to you, retain their power even if they still have not yet seen the light. Thank you very much.